It's been a little over a month since the Alaska meeting. In 2 days, it will be 8 months since the Trump administration came to power. You know much better than anyone that this meeting looked promising. We know from Trump's public statements that when he entered the White House, he gave us grounds for serious hopes. Where are we now in Russian-American relations? I would disagree with the fact that we had serious hopes when Trump won the election and entered the White House for a second term. We appreciated and appreciate his openness and directness. He never evades, does not hide his thoughts. We appreciate his focus on results. These are what he calls deals in the broadest sense of the word. These include mutually beneficial projects in the economy, space, natural resource development, and modern technologies. But he had the same charge in his first term. Back then, the Democrats, speaking in Russian, planted a pig on Trump when, a few days before his inauguration, Obama imposed unjustified sanctions against us, expelling more than 100 diplomats with their family members and arresting diplomatic properties. This was left as a legacy to Trump. I remember how Flynn, who was running for National Security Advisor at the time, called our ambassador and said that the Democrats had acted meanly. They wanted to prevent our relations from developing normally. They left such a legacy. We ask you not to react. We will fix all this. It was not possible to fix it, because the deep state in Trump's first term was immeasurably more influential than it is now. It is noticeable that this time, the 47th President of the United States, preparing for a new term, drew the right conclusions from previous experience and defines slightly different forms of communication with this deep state. Trump has formed a strong, influential team of like-minded people. He had nothing like this during his first term. The way he defends the interests of the United States differs from the ideologized policies of his predecessors, who, led by Biden, in fact, set a course for the complete isolation of Russia. Gathered around him the entire Western camp, which willingly united around an aggressive confrontational policy. In recent years, we have not had the opportunity to talk at any level. The only exception was the meeting between Russian President Putin and then as President Biden in Geneva on June 16, 2021. It was a good conversation, but it didn't lead to anything. All this was a cover for the deep-seated aggression that was brewing against the Russian Federation. The line pursued by the Democratic administration to suppress our country as an independent player. As for the new administration, the situation is different. Of course, slogans like America #1 and Make America Great Again reflect the main strategic directions of American policy under any administration. I have already told you about our first meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Rubio on February 18 this year, with the participation of Russian Presidential aide Yuri Ushakov and U.S. National Security Advisor Mikhail Waltz, who has now been confirmed as the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations. We spoke frankly. Rubio began by saying that the current American administration in the field of foreign policy does not proceed from any ideologized postulates, but from national interests. She understands perfectly well that all other countries, especially the great powers, also have the right to proceed from their national interests. He further said that in those situations, and there are relatively few of them, when great powers have the same interests, it would be a gross mistake not to use this coincidence to translate it into mutually beneficial material projects that will bring economic benefits to partners. And in those cases, and most of them are, when the national interests of the great powers do not coincide, it would be a mistake, even a crime, to allow this discrepancy to turn into a confrontation, especially a heated one. I agreed with that. This is the policy that Russian President Vladimir Putin is pursuing in the international arena, looking for common ground and not allowing disagreements to spill over into hot and cold confrontation. It is better not to allow this. In Alaska, this approach has been fully confirmed. As you know, the Alaska meeting was preceded by several visits by Witkoff to Moscow as special envoy of US President Trump. He met with Russian President Putin. As a result of these visits, the Americans formulated their approach to the problem of settlement in Ukraine and how they see their role.
В отличие от всех других западных деятелей, прежде всего, конечно, таких европейских лидеров, как Стармер, Макрон, Урсула фон дер Ляйен, Мерц.
Unlike all other Western figures, Starmer, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Merz, Stubb, Rutte, their actions and positions were that Ukraine is right. It is necessary to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, restore Ukraine's sovereignty within the borders of 1991. Trump and his team, we have repeatedly shown, including publicly, an understanding of the need to address the root causes of the conflict. Trump has repeatedly said publicly that drawing Ukraine into NATO was a mistake. He clearly showed that for a settlement, it is necessary to forget about these encroachments and build security on other principles. Secondly, the current American administration understands that the realities on Earth are explained not by the fact that someone wants to cut off territories from someone, but by the fact that people live in these territories, which are now controlled by Russia, and which still partially remain under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. Religious and other rights were legally abolished. The Russian language is banned in schools, universities, at all levels of education, and in the media. Russian language media outlets, both owned by Russian and Ukrainian owners, are closed in Ukraine. Books in Russian were thrown out of libraries, just like Hitler did in the 30s. Only the fascists burn these books, and Ukrainians are a tight-fisted people. They hand them over for waste paper, receiving money for it. All cultural events in Russian are taboo, as in everyday situations. For example, in a store, if you come and ask for a pack of salt in Russian, the seller may well say that he will not serve you until you switch to the move. During the talks in Alaska, we also mentioned that, among other things, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is banned in Ukraine. President of the USA Trump was amazed. He asked US Secretary of State Mike Rubio several times if this was true. You could see his attitude towards this kind of thing. Understanding the root causes led to the specific proposals that were put on the table. They assumed that the interests of the Russian Federation in ensuring its security were taken into account, bearing in mind the NATO factor, as well as the fate of the people who live in these territories. This came under the heading of territory exchange in the media space, but it was about what I said just now. As I understand it, following the meeting in Alaska, Witkoff conveyed to the Ukrainian side the American vision of how to move forward, taking into account the understandings reached in Anchorage. This signal was rejected by the Ukrainian side. We want to maintain the dialogue that has been established between our presidents, the heads of foreign policy departments, national security assistants, special representatives of the two presidents, and through other channels. We see that the American side has the same desire. The Ukrainian crisis is now in the foreground, But it follows from numerous speeches and statements by us President Trump that if he had been president, this war would never have started. This was repeated in Alaska.
Президент Путин такое предположение поддержал. И заявление Дональда Трампа о том, что
Russian President Putin supported this assumption. Trump's statement that this Biden's war, not his, reflects a situation where he really pays primary attention to overcoming the Ukrainian crisis, not because he considers it the main conflict on the planet, but because he inherited the situation in international relations when the Ukrainian crisis was artificially created, when Russia was left with no choice but to launch a special military operation to protect the rights of people whom the authorities in Kiev, who came after the coup in 2014, declared terrorists, inhumans, creatures that the then president of Ukraine Poroshenko publicly, from the high tribunes, he promised to rot in basements, and Zelensky, calling them creatures, recommended them to get to Russia, as they live in Ukraine, but feel involved in Russian culture. Since 2008, we have proposed to establish security in Europe, taking into account the interests of all participants, including Russia, Ukraine, and European countries. All this was rejected over and over again. In December 2021, for the last time, we made proposals to conclude agreements between Russia and the United States, and Russia and NATO.
Никакого другого выбора после негативной, даже такой высокомерно-презрительной реакции Запада на эти наши...
After the negative, arrogant, contemptuous reaction of the West to them, there was no other choice left. What happened happened. The West has done everything to ensure that the anti-Russia, made out of Ukraine and set against our country to contain, weaken and suppress, occupies a leading place on the world agenda. I think that precisely because this is an artificially created war by Biden and his team that does not reflect the philosophy of the current administration, the Trump team wants to remove it from the agenda in order to remove obstacles to normal economic, technological, and other cooperative relations. This will not be easy, because the United States has a peculiar approach to how to solve economic issues now. 8 months have passed, and as far as I know, no concrete results have been seen yet. With one exception, it has become easier for Americans to issue visas. Many of the other things we've talked about are at the talking stage. I understand that the dialogue has become more in-depth, but so far there are no results. Both you and Russian President Putin have said that the blockages in our relations are such that it would be impossible to remove them immediately. I am concerned that, as President Trump says, that he is disappointed, that he cannot wait, that he can apply sanctions against Russia, but does not want to do so because he treats Putin well, and that this is not the best way to deal with Russia, but it shows elements of frustration and impatience. How do you react to this? US President Trump, as he himself constantly emphasizes, is a man of action, deals and business. He was used to negotiating quickly. As merchants in Russia and the Russian Empire agreed, they struck a deal. And tomorrow everything they agreed on will be implemented. When as President Trump says that he is disappointed, I can't say that I know him well, but I've talked to him several times, and I have some idea. It seems to me that this is partly due to the fact that he wants quick solutions. As he constantly emphasizes, listing world conflicts that have lasted 4 decades, in which he tried to play a positive role, he considers it possible to resolve quickly. Somewhere it may work out, somewhere it is unlikely. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a separate matter. This is a tragedy, a humanitarian disaster, like many other crises on Earth. The desire of us, President Trump, and his team to contribute and take the initiative to reconcile irreconcilable opponents who can object to the fact that peace is better than war. A bad peace is better than a good quarrel, as we say. As for the Ukrainian affairs, I do not see any problems with the fact that sanctions can be applied against Russia. A huge, record number of sanctions for that historical period were imposed under President Trump during his first term. We began to draw conclusions from the situation when the West imposed these sanctions on us. Then, during the Biden era, sanctions replaced any diplomatic work, when no one tried to seek any compromises, when they said, "Do not meddle in the management of any part of the globe." They say, "We, the West, have ruled and will rule everywhere." This is evident not only in relation to Ukraine, but also to all our neighbors. The West is active, disregarding our interests in a number of cases. Our partners in the post-Soviet space are well aware of this. They understand that they have not only obligations within the CIS, the CIESTO, the EU, and the SCO, but also vital interests realized through alliance and partnership with Russia. But that doesn't stop the West. Returning to the topic of how the United States will act further on the problems of Ukraine. I think we will have additional contacts. We broke up on the fact that in Anchorage we accepted the logic that Trump promoted based on an understanding of the root causes and our position. He did not refute this logic. Trump said he would consult with his allies. Then they flew to Washington. All these Europeans have made no secret of the fact that they have publicly dissuaded and are dissuading the US leadership from any constructive actions towards Russia in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. They want to return the United States to the slippery slope it followed under Biden, when it was the Biden war. The Europeans want to make it a Trump war as well. They don't hide it. Have they been unable to do this yet? I don't think that's so. Recently, there were reports that the United States signed the first contract or agreement, which will no longer be the implementation of contracts signed under Biden, but something new for shipments of weapons worth $500 million, which will be paid for by the Europeans. $400 million. The Congress voted at the expense of the United States. Trump promised that he would not do this, but Congress accepted it without the opposition of the White House. As you rightly said, NATO is buying $500 million for Ukraine, but it is buying it. Yes, it's not new. US President Trump has said this from the very beginning, that this will continue to be the case. They say, "We will not incur losses, but we will make a profit on the sale of weapons that Europe gives to Ukraine or to anyone." This is such a step, especially in the part that is on the line of Congress. On the other hand, diplomacy and business are things where sometimes someone who takes some steps calculates the next steps and believes that somewhere it is possible to throw a bone in the form of a concession. The fact that after Alaska, Trump clearly began to advocate not an ultimatum for a truce without conditions, but for a long-term sustainable settlement is an important step. The decision of the White House, I don't see them moving away from it yet. I want to clarify one important thing that you said about the difference between the Trump team today and the Trump team with his first administration. It's not for me to tell you. You've dealt with these people. There were people in the old team who were not conservatives, globalists. They openly ignored the opinion of their president. There is no such thing now.
Сейчас такого нет. Но вот я хочу вас спросить, ваше впечатление, что у него появилась
I want to
команда
ask you,
единомышленников,
is it your impression that he has a team of like-minded people such as Nixon and Kissinger who supported their president, or is it a team of loyalists who in no way want to betray, provoke and upset Trump, but quietly work together with the Europeans and want to shift Trump's position towards a greater confrontation with Russia?
У меня не сложилось такого впечатления. Может быть, термин «лоялисты» и применим к этим.
I didn't get that impression. The term loyalists applies to his staff and team, but from my point of view, I do not know the inner kitchen, only in a positive way. After all, a loyalist is a person who will not betray. If he starts playing along with the opposing team behind his leader's back, that's already the case. You probably know US Treasury Secretary Bessent. Not personally. I haven't talked to him. I don't know him personally, but I read what he says. He's clearly calling for sanctions and is actively working with the Europeans. He invites European delegations to Washington to develop a joint agenda for sanctions against Russia. Then he brings it to the president.
У него налицо, конечно, убежденность.
He clearly believes that Russia needs to be punished. The conviction that he can assume the powers of not only the Minister of Finance. Do you remember when he worked for Soros? Yes, he worked for Soros. It seems to me that he is going beyond his mandate and the line outlined by us President Trump. I don't think this negates the importance of the support of President Trump from the majority of his team members. Yes, the Treasury Secretary in the United States is an important figure, but there is also a Vice President and a Secretary of State, and there are different special representatives. There is Witkoff. It is clearly aimed at finding a balance of interests. We understand that. Russian President Putin has said more than once that, in the end, a sustainable agreement is a compromise. We are ready to seek them out, provided that our legitimate security interests and the legitimate interests of the Russian people in Ukraine are secured in the same way as the legitimate interests of other participants in such an agreement. I have already mentioned that the Trump administration has an understanding of the problems related to NATO. They said it publicly. There is an understanding that the referendums held in Crimea and other territories cannot be ignored. Any agreement must necessarily take into account the results of these referendums. How exactly, right away, step by step is another matter. They have recognized the essence of our approaches and are working on this basis. The rest of the Western public, with the exception of Hungary and Slovakia, these are the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Finland, the European Commission, and NATO that I mentioned. When we launched the special military operation, remember how it started? They all said that Russia must suffer a strategic defeat on the battlefield. They kept this line for about a year and a half. Then they changed their rhetoric and started saying that Russia should not be allowed to win. Now, over the past 6 months, they have moved to hysterical demands for an immediate truce without any conditions. When they began to put forward this slogan for the first time, French President Macron, commenting on it, answering a question from journalists, said that they would continue supplying weapons to Ukraine without any conditions. Like Freud, what they really wanted came out of him. The Minsk agreements were also signed in order to pump Ukraine with weapons. It is no less significant that none of the Europeans, although they constantly bring the topic of human rights to the fore in negotiations with any country, does not mention human rights in Ukraine. Instead, they want the part of Ukraine that will remain after the settlement, although they are shouting about the 1991 borders. They understand everything perfectly well. Under the control of the current regime, they are not going to change it. to occupy and continue to support the Nazi entity, which is now headed by Zelensky. Russian speakers, who speak Russian as their native language, don't care what happens in this territory, which they will occupy in their dreams and illusions. No one mentions the need to repeal these absolutely disgusting laws. No language is banned anywhere in any country. Even in the context of the Arab-Israeli confrontation, Arabic and Hebrew are not banned either in Israel or in Arab countries. We specifically asked many representatives of Western journalism why they don't write about it. In the West, journalists are usually meticulous and intrusive. Such an obvious thing as the destruction of an entire language in the whole country would somehow interest them. The only thing that got through was the persistence of our Hungarian colleagues. When they pushed the topic of Ukraine's accession to the European Union, they wrote framework documents that would determine the content of the negotiating chapters. There is a whole expanded text per page demanding that Ukraine respect the rights of national minorities. These rights are still recorded in the Constitution of Ukraine. It has not been changed in this part. Ignoring the Constitution, they adopted laws that directly contradict it. The documents that were discussed and approved in connection with the desire to involve Ukraine in the EU explicitly state that they must ensure that their legislation complies with the requirements of international documents on the protection of national minority rights and human rights. Approved and forgotten. Hungary alone insisted on this. I know this, but even what they eventually accepted at Budapest's insistence, no one is going to fulfill. No one is making these claims against them. I'm trying to understand what the European leaders are trying to achieve, with the exception of Hungary and Slovakia, of course. You just said that they mean, among other things, the de facto occupation of Ukraine. They say they want to have NATO military units in Ukraine, so that these are not some symbolic units, but units with real military strength, air defense and American air cover. At the same time, they say they will pump up Ukraine with weapons, so that she could defend herself on her own against Russia. But in order for her to be able to defend herself confidently, she needs to be given a deadline, so that she could attack as well. I want to ask you, either they completely do not understand and refuse to understand the real Russian strategic concerns, and that Russia will not allow such things, or they use such arguments to block the agreement. What is your opinion? It seems to me that there is also a third aspect. I have no doubt that they want to block the agreement, that they do not want a settlement that will put an end to their years-long attempts to make Ukraine a permanent irritant or even a threat to the Russian Federation. There is no doubt. Another consideration may be the desire to revive the European war machine, which is now almost entirely dependent on the United States. This desire is dictated by the approach that Trump has taken to America first. They say that we need to make America great again, and not waste money on charity, ensuring the security of Europe. This has already been publicly stated in Washington. It is not for nothing that German Chancellor Merz, in his recent speeches, you have to read to understand where this everything is heading, began to talk about the need for Europe's strategic autonomy in military terms. However, he made a reservation out of politeness that, of course, America remains their ally, but, they say, times are changing and they need to take on more responsibility. This is roughly a reaction to Trump's demands that Europe take more responsibility for ensuring its security, 5% of the military spending budget, and so on. One consideration in this regard Their economic situation is getting worse and worse. They cut down all the branches on which they were sitting in terms of ensuring energy security and well-being based on cheap, reliable energy supplies. And with pride, as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has been doing for years. They say that they are finally getting rid of their dependence on Russian energy resources. However, she does not mention at what price, and the prices are terrible. If you just look at the oil and gas quotes they receive instead of Russian hydrocarbons, the population is already beginning to grumble. Militant slogans, whipping up passions, and inflating the non-existent Russian threat probably help distract some of the discontented and force them to accept difficulties for the sake of survival in this war. They still say that the Baltic states, Poland, and the NATO countries will be next after Ukraine. They can't hear anything. President Putin of the Russian Federation has said many times, we have not, do not have, and will not have any plans to attack any NATO or EU country. Since 2008, we have been proposing documents that will guarantee the indivisibility of security and the refusal of each country to strengthen its security at the expense of others. It was signed by everyone within the framework of the RUSS summits, when, despite all these solemn statements, the alliance continued to expand. We asked them, how is that? Here are the RUSS documents. It says bluntly, no organization in the Euro-Atlantic space will claim dominance. And NATO is doing exactly that. They told us that it was a political commitment, despite the fact that they were signed by presidents and prime ministers. Back in 2008, we said, okay, political. Since they are essentially acceptable to you, let's codify them into a contract. The answer was that political commitments remain political, and legal guarantees of security can only be provided to NATO members. It was a deliberate policy to undermine all the principles of the RUSS, where we were dragged in so intensively. One more thing worries me. In the same Germany, there are also revanchist sentiments there. However, in other European countries too, I was amazed at the speed with which all the neutral polish came off the Finnish leadership, and how Finnish revanchism just rushes out sorry for the not very parliamentary expression. But in Germany, Chancellor Merz repeatedly insists in his public speeches that Germany is reborn. Germany has revised its laws to dramatically increase spending on weapons. And most importantly, the country must once again become the main military power in Europe. I do not know if he understands the word again in this sentence, but I think everyone else understands. It worries me a lot, and not only me, but many in Russia, when they hear such statements from the German Chancellor. Today I am reading a statement by the new Polish president that Poland needs access to nuclear weapons. Trump has convinced most European countries to raise military spending to 5% of GDP, which begs the question, isn't there a new threat to Russia's security? That's exactly the case. Therefore, we have repeatedly reacted to how Europe is now trying to build its line on the Ukrainian issue, contrary to Trump's principled approaches, trying to break them as they were formulated in Alaska, and then presented to us allies, and once again involve the United States in some kind of games to contain Russia, including, as you mentioned, providing air cover to those troops that the NATO and EU members hope to bring into Ukrainian territory under the control of the Zelensky regime. This is also reflected in the fact that they replace all key concepts in the settlement processes. They demand a truce, and that's it. At the same time, Zelensky forces everyone to bring up the topic of negotiations, like a truce and a meeting right away. without any preconditions. The only calculation is to play another circus act, to show how Zelensky, so courageous, in camouflage, with a beard, begins to teach life to President Putin or someone else. It is important for him to shine on the stage. We can't do that. President Putin said he was ready to meet, but it had to be well prepared. What exactly does this mean? We need to get a reaction to the proposals that we have promoted and to the approaches that were discussed in Anchorage. Is Ukraine not doing this yet? According to our information, she rejected it. Through the special envoy of the President of the United States, Witkoff, the considerations that the Americans made after Alaska were conveyed to her, reflecting an understanding of the root causes and the need to eliminate them. They were rejected. Instead, Europe is now accusing President Putin of refusing to engage in dialogue. At the same time, they simultaneously focused on developing guarantees for Ukraine's security, which could be discussed without the Russian Federation. If you are discussing the security of one belligerent state without another belligerent state, then you want to formulate these security guarantees in support of continuing the war against your neighbor.
По-моему, это очевидно. Они, правда, оговариваются постоянно, что мы вот ведем войска, когда будет заключено соглашение.
It's obvious. However, they constantly stipulate that. They say, troops will be deployed when a settlement and truce agreement are concluded. It doesn't change anything. It only shows their focus on the following. Everything they build both during the conflict and for the period after the conflict should help to contain Russia. That's how they put it. We have a very specific argument for such games. Unfortunately, they usually don't hear our argument. I have a feeling that you, President Putin, are doing very well in dialogue with countries such as China, India, and Brazil. A new world order is being actively built. How is it progressing?
Это продвигается неостановимо, я так скажу, потому что это объективный процесс, это не...
It's progressing unstoppably. This is an objective process. It's not like someone came up with the idea to create a new bloc, and they started to concoct documents and principles on which to unite. This is a process of objective development of the global economy. New centers of economic and financial power have grown, with which comes political influence, centers for the development of modern technologies, on which the future configuration of the world economy depends. Moreover, China, but also India and Brazil have achieved and are achieving economic success based on the rules that the West laid down many decades ago in the model of globalization. It is based on fair competition, the presumption of innocence, inviolability of property, etc. In order to guarantee and enforce these principles, the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization have operated and are still operating.
Но как только Китай стал на основе этих правил обыгрывать Америку в экономической игре,
everything would be fine. But as soon as China began to beat America in the economic game based on these rules, breaks immediately began to be introduced into the functioning of these Bretton Woods institutions. If the real share of the BRICS countries in the global economy were taken into account in the distribution of votes in the IMF now, the Americans would lose their veto right. The number of US votes would drop, and the veto power would disappear. That would be a completely different story. The Americans have been blocking the work of the WTO dispute resolution body for many years. The complaints that China submits their number in the hundreds, they would inevitably lead to a verdict in favor of Beijing in response to the discriminatory barriers that the United States was erecting to combat imports of high-quality, cheap, competitive goods from China. That is why there is a crisis in the IMF and the World Bank right now. By the way, during the 3 years of the Ukrainian events, The latter issued preferential loans to Ukraine, without giving exact figures. 10 times more than loans were granted to all African countries combined during the same period. So this is also a characteristic that discredits the activities of the Bretton Woods institutions, showing their politicization. Therefore, the movement of new growing economies continues. All forecasts say that this will be a long and steady process. Of course, they will claim, and are already claiming, a more equitable place in world affairs. So far, of course, economic concerns are dominating. The BRICS countries are not always ready to get directly involved in political processes and demand the fulfillment of certain conditions. But from the point of view of political assessments, that is, the situation that is developing in the world, we have a consensus in both the BRICS and the SCO, because we don't want domination and dictate. We stand for indivisible security in all regions. Can this unanimity withstand Western pressure, and specifically Trump's demand that, say, both India and China stop buying Russian oil and gas? In fact, we are already seeing how these demands are perceived in Beijing and Delhi. Apart from the fact that this undermines the economic well-being of these countries, at least it creates serious difficulties for them, forcing them to look for new energy markets, as well as new energy sources, and forcing them to pay more. But beyond that, perhaps even more importantly than that, there is moral and political opposition to this approach. China and India are the most ancient civilizations. Talking to them in such language, they say, either you stop doing what we don't like, or we impose tariffs on you, will not work. The ongoing contacts between Beijing and Washington, between New Delhi and Washington, show that the American side understands this too. There are demanding positions, and then they start looking for generally acceptable approaches that will reflect a balance of economic interests, and at the same time will not look like an attempt to infringe on someone's political interests, national pride and principles. Now it is happening much more erratically than in the days before the disappearance of the Soviet Union, when there were camps, the Cold War, détente, etc. There are many more world leaders on the world map now. They demand and want their economic achievements to be recognized as they deserve, and their weight in the world to be recognized. It will take a whole epoch before we understand how a multipolar world will be regulated. There are many options, and political scientists are currently discussing this topic. Either some new format will be created, or there will be a chaotic game and competition, sanctions, tariffs, who's who. We are interested in streamlining these processes, but for this we need to sit down at the negotiating table and consider proposals formulated by the BRICS, SCO, African Union, and SELEC members. There are many ideas about this. These associations, reflecting regional integration processes, which already have such a global mechanism as BRICS, form the basis for a multipolar world. Some of our political scientists, I won't name names, say that a multipolar world will be formed without the West, outside the Western system. It won't be a multipolar world. It just won't be the Western world order. But we live together on a very cramped planet. This crowding is becoming more and more noticeable with the development of science and technology, hypersound, quantum computers, which are about to appear in the world, and hopefully in our country too. We believe that multipolarity should, of course, cover all regions of the world, including the West. Despite the fact that its share in the world is falling, it is still a powerful player. The first president of the United States, from my point of view, the greatest president, J. Washington, in its farewell address to the nation, emphasized that the United States should not create permanent military alliances, because these alliances acquire their own logic and dynamics, hinder the flexibility of foreign policy, and draw countries into unnecessary conflicts. This is exactly what happened with NATO, why the alliance had to continue and strengthen its functioning after the end of the Cold War is difficult to explain with rational arguments. But now I am hearing arguments, including in Moscow, from political scientists and experts, that the right answer for NATO is greater metropolitan integration of the SCO, BRICS, etc. Do you think that the response to NATO's challenge should involve some new elements of military political, if not integration, then coordination on the part of the global majority? We have military and political alliances. First of all, this is the Union State of Russia and Belarus. The CSTO and the SCO also have a serious military and political dimension to ensuring the security of the member countries. In all these formats, the goal has never been to be hostile towards anyone. The task was to ensure the security of the territories of the countries belonging to this union, without any expansionist ideas. Initially, according to the Washington Treaty, NATO is a defensive organization whose goal is to ensure the security of the territories of its member countries. But NATO began to extend its, I wanted to say, tentacles in Soviet interests far to the eastern tip of Eurasia. This was under the previous Secretary General Stoltenberg. At one of the press conferences, he was asked if NATO is still a defensive alliance that ensures the security of the territories of its member countries. He said yes. Then he was asked, what are they doing in the South China Sea? Where are they trying to promote their infrastructure? What are they doing in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia? And what are their plans in the Taiwan Strait? He said that they are moving their political infrastructure there, possibly military technical, but they are not violating anything, because in the current situation, threats to the territorial integrity of the alliance's countries come from there. I don't think it's necessary to explain to anyone that this is such a blatant, undisguised, hostile step towards China, plus the creation of such threes and fours of an anti-Chinese orientation. AUKUS Britain, the United States, Australia, attempts to draw India into anti-Chinese formats. All sorts of quads are being organized. Attempts to pull the Philippines out of ASEAN and include them in their bloc structures of a closed nature. Attempts to flirt with other ASEAN countries, violating the unity of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Exercises are being conducted. More recently, there were some kind of command exercises, which involved a huge number of countries in Southeast Asia, just Asia, and Latin America, under the auspices of the NATO powers. Hence the answer to the question of how we ensure security. Look, there are many sub-regional integration organizations in Africa. There are a lot of them in Latin America too. But both countries have common continental ones, the African Union and CELAC. Eurasia is the largest continent, where several great civilizations have existed for many millennia, and now retain their identity, where the largest amount of natural resources is concentrated, the largest part of the world in terms of population, and there is no region-wide, continent-wide structure. This is due to the fact that until recently, during the Cold War, the western part of the continent was dominated. The West was more active and more powerful than many others after centuries of superiority by Euro-Atlantic security structures. NATO as such. After that, the RUSS, also a Euro-Atlantic concept, and the European Union, which was created as a purely European structure, are now essentially merging with the North Atlantic Alliance. They sign agreements that EU members will provide their territory joint mobility if NATO suddenly decides to travel with its tanks and armored personnel carriers to the Russian border. This is also Euro-Atlantic logic, and it has exhausted itself. Ukraine's war against us, organized by the West, only underlines that the Euro-Atlantic concepts have not lived up to the promises that were made when they were created. Therefore, in 2024, Russian President Putin put forward an initiative to form a pan-Eurasian, continent-wide security architecture, starting with joining forces, starting a dialogue between various sub-regional integration structures, and gradually striving to reach a continent-wide agreement. At the same time, we specifically stipulate that the door is open to all organizations. That is, if the West wants to, then it is with it, not against it. Moreover, we have already mentioned Hungary. This year, Minsk will host the third conference, which is being held on the initiative of President Lukashenko on the topic of Eurasian security. Participated in the first two a number of European representatives and ministers, including Serbia, Hungary and Slovakia, also participated in both meetings. Now, together with our Belarusian colleagues, we are submitting a draft charter of Eurasian multipolarity and diversity to the third conference, which will be held in Minsk at the end of October. Such a conceptual framework, since we all live on the same continent, it is a sin not to use the geoeconomic and geopolitical advantages that nature, geography and history have given us. We'll see. But just at the same time, a completely different concept is in the minds of the NATO leaders. They say that NATO should extend its infrastructure to the entire Eurasian continent. They are already setting up wedges for certain regions of Eurasia. And in Central Asia, they are trying to impose such military aspects of cooperation. They are also interested in Transcaucasia. Therefore, difficult discussions are ahead. But let's compete in the arguments. We offer cooperation in a continent-wide space, on a continent-wide scale, taking into account the interests of everyone. They prefer to do the same in Eurasia. What do they want to do in Ukraine? Divide it and make a porcupine out of it, as Ursula von der Leyen wanted to do.
Оставив под этим дикобразом нацистское государство. Вот мы говорили про, вы упомянули Джорджа Вашингтона.
Leaving the Nazi state under the rule of this porcupine. You mentioned Washington. There is a lot of talk about what democracy is, what is happening in Europe with freedom of speech, with respect for human rights, with respect for the principle of non-politicization of sports, art and other areas of human activity. In this regard, I remember that in the Declaration of Independence, in my opinion, this is attributed to Jefferson, there is such a requirement that you must respect the consent of those whom you govern. The reason I remembered is because, quite recently, a couple of years ago, in one of his speeches, Goethe has quoted this requirement as one of the fundamental principles of democracy, telling how the end should evolve in the modern world. But if the consent of those you govern reflects the presence of democracy, or the absence of it, then you need to approach the situation in Ukraine from a slightly different angle again. After all, this principle, spelled out in the Declaration of Independence of the United States, was then enshrined in the United Nations, in the 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation among States. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, the General Assembly decided by consensus that the territorial integrity of all states should be respected, whose governments respect the right of nations to self-determination, and therefore represent the interests of the entire population living in the relevant territory. How could those who came to power in Ukraine as a result of the coup represent the interests of Crimea, Donbas, Novorossiya? They said they did not want to deal with these putschists, just as during the period of the decolonization of Africa, the colonialists completely ceased to represent the interests of those whom they enslaved, and those whom they enslaved categorically refused to live under their leadership. So much for the consent of those you control. Thank you very much. We took longer than you promised us. I'll brazenly ask you one more question. Intervision. Tell us about this project. We held a press conference here in our mansion the other day. The initiative was born in a non-governmental foundation called the Art Traditions Foundation for the preservation and support of cultural heritage and the development of national and world culture. This fund was established about 5 years ago. They contacted us and said that they had an idea to revive the Intervision contest, but in new conditions. This will not be a contest of the socialist camp, as it was during the Soviet Union, but a contest based on the countries of the world majority, open to all comers. We have consulted with the government, the presidential administration, and Channel 1, because it is his brand. As a result, they reported to the President of Russia, who approved the project. The climax will take place on September 20th at the live arena. More than 20 participants from all continents. I hope it will be interesting.